What if I told you that the most dangerous secrets of the Cold War weren't hidden in locked safes or encrypted communications, but right there on a crumpled grocery receipt that anyone could have seen, yet only one person truly noticed? Imagine this. It's 1987, a small American town where nothing ever happens, where the most exciting event of the week is the Friday night high school football game, and where everyone knows everyone else's business, or at least they think they do. In this town, there's a grocery store, the kind of place where the automatic doors stick sometimes, where the fluorescent lights flicker in aisle 3, and where the same faces come through the checkout line day after day, buying the same things, living their predictable, comfortable lives. Behind register number 4 sits Margaret Chen, a 34-year-old cashier who has been scanning items for 7 years, her hands moving with the mechanical precision of someone who has rung up tens of thousands of transactions, her mind often wandering to her evening plans or her daughter's upcoming piano recital. Because, let's be honest, how much mental energy does it really take to scan a box of cereal and a gallon of milk? But on this particular Tuesday afternoon in March, something happens that will transform Margaret from an invisible worker in a forgettable job into an unlikely hero who will help expose one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence operations ever conducted on American soil. It starts innocuously enough, as all great stories do, with a man Margaret has seen before, though she couldn't tell you his name if her life depended on it, which, as it turns out, it very nearly will. He's ordinary in every sense of the word. Average height, average build, wearing a beige windbreaker and khaki pants, the kind of outfit designed to make someone disappear into a crowd, and yet there's something about him that makes Margaret's subconscious mind file away a tiny note of discomfort, though she can't quite articulate why. He places his items on the conveyor belt. A jar of pickles, exactly 3 cans of tomato soup, a box of baking soda, a package of red shoelaces, a greeting card with a lighthouse on it, and a magazine about woodworking. Now, you might be thinking, what's so strange about that? People buy random combinations of things all the time, right? And you'd be absolutely correct, which is exactly why this method of communication was so brilliant, so devastatingly simple that it had been operating successfully for years without detection. But Margaret, whose mind has been dulled by years of repetitive work, suddenly feels a strange electricity in her fingertips as she scans each item. And here's where it gets interesting. She has seen this exact man buy this exact strange combination before, not once but twice, always on a Tuesday, always at approximately the same time, and always paying in cash with exact change. The human brain is an incredible pattern recognition machine, evolved over millions of years to spot the tiger hiding in the grass, to detect the subtle changes in a friend's voice that signal danger, to notice when something is just slightly off in our environment, and Margaret's brain is screaming at her right now, even though she doesn't understand why. Have you ever had that feeling, that inexplicable sense that something isn't right, even though you can't point to any concrete evidence? That's what Margaret is experiencing as she finishes the transaction, hands the man his receipt, and watches him walk away with his peculiar collection of items. After her shift ends, Margaret sits in her car in the parking lot, the receipt tape from her register running through her mind like a film reel, and she makes a decision that will change everything. Instead of driving home to make dinner and help with homework, she drives to the public library where she begins to research something that seems absolutely crazy. The idea that grocery stores could be used for espionage, that ordinary purchases could contain hidden messages, that the enemy could be hiding in plain sight among the potato chips and laundry detergent. What Margaret doesn't know yet is that she has just stumbled upon a technique called commercial cover communication, a method Soviet intelligence had perfected where specific items purchased in specific combinations and quantities could convey complex information to handlers, a system so elegant that it required no suspicious meetings, no dead drops in parks, no encrypted radio transmissions that could be intercepted, just an ordinary person buying ordinary things in an ordinary store. But here's the question that will keep you watching. What gave it away? What was it about those specific items that finally cracked the code? And more importantly, what happened when Margaret discovered she wasn't dealing with just one spy, but an entire network. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a minimum wage cashier outsmarted trained intelligence officers, how she risked everything including her family's safety to pursue the truth, and how one grocery receipt led to the unraveling of an operation that reached into the highest levels of American defense infrastructure. But before we dive into the incredible detective work that Margaret is about to undertake, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel brings you true stories that sound too crazy to be real, but are absolutely verified by declassified documents and first-hand accounts. And drop a comment below telling me what you would do if you notice something suspicious like this. Would you investigate, or would you convince yourself you were imagining things? Because Margaret is about to face that exact dilemma, and her choice will determine whether an enemy operation continues undetected, or whether one ordinary person can actually make a difference in the shadow war being fought in grocery store aisles across America. The next morning, Margaret arrives at work with a small notebook tucked into her apron pocket, telling herself she's being ridiculous, that she's letting her imagination run wild, that she's probably watched too many spy movies with her husband on weekend nights. But she can't shake the feeling, that persistent itch in the back of her mind that something is terribly wrong. For the next 3 weeks, Margaret does something that could get her fired if her manager found out. She starts keeping detailed records of every unusual transaction she processes, writing down not just what people buy, but when they buy it, how they pay, and any patterns she notices. And at first, there's nothing, just ordinary people buying ordinary things in ordinary ways, which makes her feel foolish. Makes her wonder if she's losing her mind, or if the monotony of her job has finally broken something in her brain. But then it happens again. The same man. The same bizarre combination of items. And this time, Margaret notices something she missed before. He places the items on the conveyor belt in a very specific order. Always the pickles first, then the soup cans arranged with the labels facing the same direction, then the baking soda, the shoelaces, the greeting card face down, and, finally, the magazine. When she gets home that night, Margaret spreads her notes across the kitchen table and begins to see what her subconscious has been screaming at her for weeks. It's not random at all. It's a pattern, a language, a code hidden in the most mundane transaction imaginable. She starts researching at the library during her lunch breaks, reading everything she can find about Cold War espionage, about how spies communicate, about dead drops and brush passes and all the exotic techniques that seem so far removed from her small-town life, until she stumbles upon an article from a counterintelligence journal that her librarian friend helps her access. An article that describes exactly what she's been witnessing: the use of commercial transactions as a signaling method, where the items purchased, their quantities, their order, even the time of purchase can all convey information to a handler who knows how to read the message. Margaret's hands are shaking as she reads, because this means she's not crazy. This means what she's seeing is real, but it also means something much more terrifying. There's a spy operating in her town, using her checkout line to send messages, and she has no idea what to do with this information. She considers going to the police, but what would she say? That a man buying pickles and soup is suspicious? They'd laugh her out of the station, or worse, they'd think she was having some kind of breakdown, a middle-aged woman whose brain has been turned to mush by years of scanning barcodes. So Margaret makes a decision that is either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, probably both. She's going to figure out the code herself. She's going to understand what messages are being sent, and only then will she have enough proof to take to the authorities. Over the next 2 months, Margaret becomes obsessed, and I mean truly obsessed, in a way that starts to worry her family. Her husband asking why she's spending so much time scribbling in notebooks, her daughter wondering why Mom seems distracted during dinner. But Margaret can't stop because she's discovered something extraordinary. The man isn't the only one. There are others, at least 3 other regular customers who come in with similarly strange shopping patterns. And here's the brilliant part. They never acknowledge each other. They never come in at the same time. They maintain perfect operational security, but they're all part of the same system. She's sure of it now. Margaret starts noticing that certain items seem to appear more frequently in these suspicious transactions. The pickles always mean something, she's certain. Perhaps they indicate the type of information being passed, and the number of soup cans varies between 1 and 5, which could represent different handlers or different levels of urgency. And the greeting cards always have specific images on them: lighthouses, mountains, beaches, flowers, each one possibly indicating a different message category. She creates a spreadsheet, teaching herself to use the new computer at the library, entering every data point she can remember from the past 3 months, and slowly, agonizingly slowly, patterns begin to emerge from the noise. But here's where Margaret's investigation takes a dangerous turn. One day, while she's processing a transaction for a regular customer, someone she's checked out hundreds of times, a sweet, elderly woman who always buys cat food and tea, Margaret notices the woman using the exact same placement technique with her items, the same deliberate ordering, the same specific brands, and Margaret realizes with a cold dread that this network is bigger than she ever imagined, that it includes people she would never in a million years suspect, that the enemy isn't just among them. The enemy is woven into the fabric of their community so thoroughly that Margaret starts to question everyone, starts to see potential spies in every customer who pays with exact change or arranges their items just a little too carefully. The paranoia begins to eat at her, making her jumpy, making her suspicious of neighbors she's known for years, and she knows she needs to act soon before either she completely loses her mind or before the spies realize that someone has noticed their pattern, because Margaret has read enough about intelligence work to know that good spies constantly monitor for detection, constantly look for signs that their methods have been compromised. Then Margaret gets her breakthrough, the piece of information that will transform her suspicions into actionable intelligence. She's working the late shift on a Thursday evening when she sees something that makes her blood run cold. The beige windbreaker man comes through her line again, but this time, instead of his usual strange combination, he buys completely normal items: milk, bread, eggs, nothing suspicious at all, except that he pays with a credit card, something she's never seen him do before, and when Margaret glances at the name on the card, she recognizes it. It's the name of an engineer who works at the nearby defense contractor facility, the place that manufactures guidance systems for military missiles, the facility that everyone in town knows about but nobody talks about because the work there is classified. Margaret's mind is racing because this means one of two things. Either the spy has stolen this engineer's identity, which would be a serious breach in itself, or worse, much worse, the engineer is the spy. Someone with access to America's most sensitive military technology has been passing information to the Soviets right under everyone's noses, using Margaret's grocery store as a communication hub. She needs to verify this, needs to be absolutely certain before she takes this to the authorities, so Margaret does something that crosses a line, something she knows is probably illegal but feels necessary. She starts following him. Not every day. She's not trained for that, and she knows she'd be spotted immediately, but once a week she takes a different route home from work, a route that happens to go past the engineer's house, and she watches. Not like a creepy stalker, but like someone trying to confirm a terrible truth. What Margaret sees over the next few weeks confirms her worst fears. The engineer has visitors at odd hours, receives mail from international locations, and, most damning of all, she sees him one evening placing items in his trash can at midnight, not just throwing away garbage like a normal person, but carefully placing specific items in specific positions. Another form of communication, she realizes, another layer to this incredibly sophisticated operation. Now Margaret knows she has enough evidence to take to the FBI, enough proof to show she's not just a paranoid cashier but someone who has stumbled onto a real threat. But she's also terrified because she's learned enough about espionage to know that spies don't just quietly surrender when they're caught. They protect themselves, they eliminate threats, and Margaret has just made herself a very big threat. The question now isn't whether Margaret should report what she's found. It's whether she can do it safely, whether she can blow the whistle on this operation without putting herself and her family in danger, and whether anyone will even believe the incredible story she has to tell. Because how does a grocery store cashier convince the FBI that she's uncovered a Soviet spy network using nothing but shopping receipts and a notebook full of observations? But Margaret is about to discover that she's not alone, that there are other people who have noticed strange patterns, other threads that when pulled will unravel an operation so vast and so perfectly hidden that it will shock the intelligence community and change how America thinks about domestic espionage forever. So stay with me, because what happens next will show you just how far one determined person can go when they refuse to ignore what everyone else has missed. Margaret sits in her car outside the local FBI field office for 20 minutes, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles have turned white, rehearsing what she's going to say, trying to figure out how to make herself sound credible instead of crazy, because she knows how this looks. She knows that walking into a federal building with a notebook full of grocery store observations and claiming to have discovered a Soviet spy ring sounds exactly like the kind of thing an unhinged person would do. She's already imagined the scene 100 times. The bored receptionist, the condescending agent who humors her for 5 minutes before escorting her out, the embarrassment of having her concerns dismissed, maybe even a call to her employer suggesting she needs a mental health evaluation. But Margaret has come too far to turn back now. She's invested too much time, taken too many risks, and most importantly, she knows what she's seen is real. So she takes a deep breath, grabs her notebook and the manila folder containing her spreadsheets and copied receipts, and walks through those doors with more courage than she's ever needed in her entire life. The receptionist is exactly as bored as Margaret imagined, barely looking up as Margaret explains in a voice that's trying too hard not to sound nervous that she needs to speak with someone about a national security matter. And for a moment, Margaret thinks this is it. This is where her investigation ends, dismissed at the front desk like someone reporting a UFO sighting. But then something unexpected happens. The receptionist picks up the phone, speaks quietly to someone, and within 3 minutes, Margaret is being escorted down a hallway to a small conference room, where a man in his early 40s wearing a wrinkled suit introduces himself as Special Agent Robert Morrison. And the look on his face is one of polite skepticism mixed with the weary patience of someone who deals with conspiracy theorists on a regular basis. Margaret starts talking, and she can hear herself rambling, jumping between different observations, trying to explain the patterns and the codes and the specific combinations of items, and she watches Agent Morrison's expression shift from polite attention to barely concealed amusement, and she knows she's losing him, knows that every word she says is making her sound less credible, so she stops mid-sentence, takes a breath, and changes tactics completely. Instead of trying to convince him with her theories, she simply opens her notebook and starts showing him the data, the dates, the times, the specific items, the patterns she's documented over 4 months of careful observation, and she watches something change in Agent Morrison's face, a subtle shift from dismissive to genuinely interested, because whatever else Margaret might be, she's clearly meticulous, clearly intelligent, and clearly onto something that at minimum deserves further investigation. Agent Morrison asks her to wait, leaves the room with her notebook, and Margaret sits alone for 45 minutes convinced she's made a terrible mistake, convinced that they're probably calling her husband or her boss or maybe even preparing to have her committed. But when Morrison returns, he's not alone. He's brought 2 other agents, and the dynamic in the room has completely changed. They're not humoring her anymore. They're interrogating her, but not in a hostile way, in the way that professionals probe a potential intelligence source, asking detailed questions about the customers, about the store layout, about her observations. And Margaret realizes with a mixture of relief and terror that they believe her, or at least they believe she might be on to something real. What Margaret doesn't know, what Agent Morrison and his colleagues can't tell her yet, is that the FBI has been investigating the defense contractor facility for 8 months, ever since the NSA detected anomalous communications patterns that suggested classified information was being leaked. But despite extensive surveillance, despite wiretaps and mail intercepts and following suspected employees, they haven't been able to identify the method of communication, haven't been able to catch anyone in the act of passing secrets, and the investigation has been going cold, frustrating everyone involved, until Margaret Chen walked through their door with a theory so simple, so elegantly low-tech, that it never occurred to anyone to look for it. Because who uses grocery store purchases to communicate in the age of sophisticated electronics and encrypted communications? The Soviets, that's who, because they understand that the best place to hide something is right out in the open, in the flow of ordinary life where nobody thinks to look. Agent Morrison makes a decision that will either validate Margaret's months of obsessive investigation or expose her theory as the paranoid fantasy of an overworked cashier. He's going to insert an undercover agent into the grocery store as an employee, someone who can observe these transactions firsthand and verify Margaret's claims. But here's the dangerous part. Here's where Margaret's role shifts from concerned citizen to active participant in a counterintelligence operation. They need her to continue working her normal shifts, continue processing these transactions, but now she'll be part of a surveillance operation, wearing a wire, documenting everything, and, most dangerous of all, acting completely normal around people who might be trained intelligence officers, people who are experts at detecting when someone is watching them. Margaret should say no, should tell them to find someone else, should go back to her safe, boring life of scanning groceries and going home to dinner with her family. But instead, she hears herself agreeing, feels herself being pulled deeper into a world she never wanted to enter, because she's come too far to stop now, because she needs to know if she's right, because some part of her has been awakened by this investigation, some part that was dormant during all those years of mind-numbing routine work, and she can't go back to sleep now, even if she wanted to. The next 2 weeks are the most stressful of Margaret's life. She's wearing a small recording device taped to her skin beneath her uniform shirt. She's hyper-aware of every customer, every transaction, wondering if this is the moment when one of the spies will notice that something has changed, that she's paying too much attention, that her carefully practiced routine has developed subtle tells that will give her away, and at night she lies awake wondering what happens if they discover what she's doing, if they realize she's working with the FBI, because she's read enough spy novels and watched enough news reports to know that intelligence work is dangerous, that people get hurt, that cooperation with Soviet intelligence officers can end very badly for those who interfere with their operations. But Margaret also discovers something unexpected. She's good at this, surprisingly good at maintaining her cover, at acting naturally while observing carefully, at processing transactions with the same bored efficiency she's displayed for years, while mentally cataloging every detail for the agents who debrief her each evening in unmarked cars parked in various locations around town, and the undercover agent who's been placed in the store as a stock clerk confirms what Margaret has been saying, confirms that the patterns are real, that specific customers are indeed using purchases to communicate, and, most importantly, confirms that the engineer from the defense contractor is at the center of this network, that he's not just a spy but appears to be running several other assets, turning Margaret's grocery store into a hub for one of the most successful intelligence operations the Soviets have ever conducted on American soil. Then comes the night that changes everything, the night that transforms Margaret from an observer into someone whose life is genuinely in danger. She's working a closing shift. It's nearly 9 p.m. and the store is almost empty when the engineer comes through her line. But this time, something is different. He's agitated, moving quickly, and instead of his usual carefully arranged items, he's buying nothing. Just approaching her register and asking in a low voice if she's noticed anyone unusual in the store lately, anyone paying too much attention, anyone asking questions. And Margaret feels her heart stop because this is it. This is the moment she's been dreading. He knows something is wrong. Maybe he's noticed the undercover agent. Maybe he's detected the increased FBI surveillance around the store. Maybe he's simply following standard tradecraft and periodically checking for compromise. But whatever the reason, he's testing her, probing to see if she's part of the problem. Margaret's training, the brief crash course the FBI gave her in how to handle unexpected situations, kicks in, and she responds with exactly the right mixture of confusion and annoyance, telling him that she barely notices anything anymore after 7 years of working here, that she's too busy trying to get through her shift to pay attention to who's shopping, and she sees him relax slightly, sees him accept this answer because it fits with who Margaret has always appeared to be. A bored, disengaged cashier who's just putting in her time until retirement. But as he walks away, Margaret sees him glance back at her once, and in that glance she sees something that makes her blood run cold. Suspicion, calculation, the look of someone who's not entirely convinced, someone who's making a mental note to watch her more carefully. Margaret immediately signals the undercover agent using the predetermined method they've established, a specific way of adjusting her register tape that means emergency contact needed, and within an hour she's sitting in Agent Morrison's car in the dark parking lot of a closed restaurant, and she's shaking, really shaking now that the adrenaline is wearing off, because she's realized something that should have been obvious from the start. She's not just observing anymore. She's been made, or at least she's on the edge of being made. And if these spies decide she's a threat, she becomes a target, and her family becomes vulnerable. And everything she thought she was doing to help her country has now put the people she loves most in potential danger. Agent Morrison makes the call that Margaret both hoped for and dreaded. They're moving up the timeline. They're going to make arrests within 48 hours, but that means the next 2 days are the most dangerous, because if the network suspects they're about to be rolled up, if they detect the increased FBI activity, they might take action to protect themselves. They might destroy evidence. They might flee. Or, worst of all, they might eliminate anyone they perceive as a threat. And Margaret is absolutely at the top of that list now. The FBI offers Margaret protective custody, offers to move her and her family to a safe house immediately, but Margaret refuses because disappearing would confirm their suspicions, would alert the network that something is wrong and give them time to escape. So instead she agrees to something even more dangerous. She'll work her next 2 shifts as normal. She'll maintain her routine. She'll be the bait that keeps the spies feeling secure, while the FBI assembles their case and coordinates the simultaneous arrests that will be needed to roll up the entire network before anyone can warn the others. Margaret goes home that night and lies to her husband for the first time in their 15-year marriage, tells him everything is fine when nothing is fine, holds her daughter a little tighter when she tucks her into bed, and stays awake until dawn wondering if she's made the right choice, wondering if her need to see this through, to prove that an ordinary person can make a difference, is actually just ego and stubbornness that's putting innocent people at risk. But by morning she's resolved to finish what she started, to play her part for 2 more days, and then hopefully this nightmare will be over and she can go back to being nobody, which suddenly sounds like the most wonderful thing in the world. The Tuesday morning shift starts like any other. Margaret clocking in at 6 a.m., the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of cleaning solution still fresh on the linoleum floors, but everything feels different now. Every sound seems amplified. Every customer who walks through the door could be a threat, and Margaret has to keep reminding herself to breathe normally, to scan items at her usual pace, to maintain the persona of the bored cashier, even though her heart is racing and she's acutely aware of the FBI agents positioned around the store in various disguises, the man pretending to shop for cereal who's actually armed and watching her register, the woman in the floral department who's coordinating the surveillance team outside, the undercover agent stocking shelves who keeps making eye contact with her to check if she's okay. The morning passes slowly, agonizingly slowly, with Margaret processing transaction after transaction, her mind constantly calculating how much longer until the FBI makes their move, until this is finally over, and then at 11:37 a.m., exactly when her notes predicted he might appear, the engineer walks through the automatic doors, and Margaret feels every muscle in her body tense because this is it. This is the moment everything has been building toward, and she has no idea if he's here for a normal shopping trip or if he's somehow learned about the investigation and has come to confront her, to silence her, to do whatever trained intelligence officers do when their operations are compromised. He approaches her register with a small basket, and Margaret forces herself to smile her standard customer service smile, to greet him the same way she greets everyone. And as he begins placing items on the conveyor belt, Margaret sees immediately that this is no ordinary transaction. This is a message, and it's unlike any message she's documented before. 7 cans of soup, not the usual 3, a jar of pickles placed sideways instead of upright, 2 greeting cards instead of 1, and a magazine about sailing that he places face down with deliberate care, and Margaret's mind is racing, trying to understand what this combination means, whether it's a routine communication or something more urgent, something that indicates the network knows they're under surveillance. As Margaret scans each item, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins, she sees Agent Morrison enter the store through the front entrance, sees him position himself near the exit, and she knows this means the arrest is happening now, not tomorrow as planned. Something has accelerated the timeline, and Margaret realizes with absolute clarity that this transaction she's processing right now is the evidence they need. This is the act that will tie the engineer to espionage. That will prove he's been using commercial transactions to communicate with his handlers, and she's the witness who will make it all hold up in court. The engineer hands her exact change, his fingers briefly touching hers, and in that moment he looks directly into her eyes. Really looks at her for the first time in all the months he's been coming through her line, and Margaret sees recognition dawn on his face, sees him understand that something is wrong, that she's not just a cashier anymore, that she knows, and his hand moves toward his jacket pocket and Margaret's training evaporates. She doesn't remember what the FBI told her to do in this situation. She just freezes. But the undercover agent is already moving, already crossing the distance between the shelves and the register, and Agent Morrison is shouting something about FBI and getting on the ground. And suddenly, there are agents everywhere. 6, 8, 10 of them materializing from positions throughout the store, and the engineer is being pushed face down onto the floor right there next to Margaret's register, his arms being wrenched behind his back, handcuffs clicking into place, and other customers are screaming and running, and Margaret just stands there behind her register watching this scene unfold like she's outside her own body, watching from a distance as the thing she set in motion reaches its inevitable conclusion. But it's not over, not even close to over, because while the arrest is happening in the grocery store, simultaneous raids are taking place across town, FBI teams hitting 4 other locations at exactly the same moment. The elderly woman with the cats being taken into custody at her home, where agents find a sophisticated radio setup hidden in her basement. 2 other assets being arrested at their workplaces, and, most critically, a team hitting the engineer's house where they find documents, microfilm, encoded messages, and evidence of a spy network that has been operating successfully for over 6 years, stealing secrets about missile guidance systems, satellite technology, and classified defense programs, passing information that has cost the United States billions of dollars in compromised technology and years of strategic advantage. Margaret is immediately escorted from the store by federal agents, taken to a secure location for debriefing, and over the next 12 hours she tells them everything, walks them through every observation, every pattern, every detail she's documented, and she learns things that make her realize just how significant her discovery really was. Learns that the engineer wasn't just passing information to the Soviets, but was recruiting other assets, building a network that reached into multiple defense contractors and government agencies. Learns that the method of communication she discovered, this grocery store code system, was being used by Soviet intelligence in at least 7 other cities across the United States, a nationwide operation that Margaret's observations have now exposed. The interrogation of the engineer, which Margaret learns about later, reveals the full scope of what she stumbled onto. The Soviets had developed this commercial communication system because it was nearly undetectable, requiring no suspicious meetings, no electronic signals that could be intercepted, no dead drops that could be surveilled, just ordinary people buying ordinary items in ordinary stores, and the genius of the system was its simplicity. Specific items in specific quantities arranged in specific orders could convey complex information, dates for meetings, acknowledgement of received materials, warnings about security concerns, instructions for new tasks, all encoded in something as mundane as pickles and soup cans and greeting cards. The engineer tries to minimize his cooperation at first, But when confronted with the evidence, with Margaret's meticulous documentation and the FBI's surveillance confirming every detail, he begins to understand that his operation is completely blown, that there's no way to explain away the patterns, no innocent reason for his behavior, and he makes the calculation that many caught spies eventually make. He agrees to cooperate in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, agrees to detail the entire network, to explain the communication codes, to identify his handlers and the other assets he's been running, and his confession leads to the largest roll-up of Soviet intelligence operations in a decade, with arrests continuing for weeks as each thread of the network is pulled and more conspirators are identified. Margaret becomes briefly famous in intelligence circles, her story circulating through the FBI and CIA as an example of how ordinary citizens can play crucial roles in counterintelligence, how sometimes the most effective surveillance comes not from sophisticated technology but from someone who simply pays attention and has the courage to report what they see. But the public never learns her name, never hears the full story, because the details of the case are classified, because Margaret's identity needs to be protected, because there might be other Soviet assets who would want revenge against the woman who destroyed their network. The aftermath is complicated in ways Margaret never anticipated. She can't return to her job at the grocery store because it's no longer safe. Her face is known to intelligence services now. Her family has to relocate to a different state under a program that's not quite witness protection but similar, and Margaret has to rebuild her entire life, find a new job, make new friends, live with the knowledge that she's part of a secret history that she can never fully share, and there are nights when she lies awake wondering if it was worth it, if the price her family paid for her investigation was too high, if she should have just ignored that strange feeling and gone on scanning groceries and living her comfortable, predictable life. But then she reads the classified briefing that Agent Morrison shares with her, the one that details how the intelligence the engineer was passing to the Soviets was being used to develop countermeasures against American missile defense systems, how the compromised technology could have cost American lives in any future conflict, how the network she exposed was one of the most damaging intelligence operations the Soviets had successfully run. And Margaret understands that her instincts were right, that her months of investigation and her willingness to put herself in danger actually mattered, actually made a difference in the vast, invisible war being fought in the shadows of the Cold War. The grocery store becomes something of a local legend, the place where a Soviet spy was caught, though the details remain murky and speculation fills the gaps that classified information leaves behind, and Margaret's former co-workers remember her as the quiet cashier who suddenly disappeared, some of them suspicious that she was involved somehow, others assuming she just quit for a better job, none of them knowing the truth. That the woman who scanned their groceries with mechanical efficiency for 7 years was actually the person who broke open a major espionage case. Years later, when the Cold War ends and some documents are finally declassified, a journalist pieces together part of the story, writes an article about the grocery store spy case without naming Margaret. And the article circulates among intelligence professionals and history enthusiasts as one of those remarkable Cold War tales that seems too strange to be true, a story about how the most dangerous secrets were hidden in the most ordinary places, and how one observant person changed everything. Margaret eventually finds peace with what happened, learns to live with the knowledge that she's part of history even if her role will never be fully acknowledged, and she tells her daughter the full story on the day her daughter turns 18, watches her child's face as she realizes that her ordinary mom, the woman who always seemed a bit boring, a bit too cautious, a bit too concerned with patterns and details, was actually a hero, was actually someone who stood up when it mattered, who saw something wrong and had the courage to act even when it meant putting everything at risk. The engineer serves 30 years in federal prison before being released as an elderly man in a prisoner exchange. The other network members receive various sentences, some cooperating for reduced time, others maintaining their silence and serving full terms. And the grocery store communication system is added to counterintelligence training programs as an example of creative tradecraft that agencies need to watch for, Margaret's observations becoming the basis for new surveillance protocols that look for patterns in commercial transactions, a legacy that will help catch other spies in other places in other times. The final chapter of this story happens 23 years after that Tuesday morning arrest, when Margaret receives a letter from the FBI inviting her to a small private ceremony in Washington, D.C., where she's presented with a commendation for her service to national security, a ceremony attended by maybe 15 people. No press, no public acknowledgement, just a room full of intelligence professionals who understand what she did and why it mattered. And as the director of counterintelligence pins the medal to her jacket and shakes her hand, Margaret thinks about that Tuesday afternoon when she first noticed something wrong with a grocery receipt. Thinks about all the small choices that led to this moment. And she realizes that the most important thing she ever did in her life happened while she was wearing a polyester uniform shirt and standing behind register number 4 in a small-town grocery store that nobody would remember except for this one extraordinary thing. So, what can we learn from Margaret Chen's story? What does it teach us about vigilance and courage and the role that ordinary people play in protecting their country? It teaches us that threats don't always announce themselves with obvious warning signs, that enemies don't always fit our preconceptions of what a spy looks like or how espionage works, that sometimes the most sophisticated operations are hidden in plain sight using the most mundane methods imaginable. And, most importantly, it teaches us that paying attention matters, that trusting your instincts matters, that one person who has the courage to investigate when something feels wrong can actually make a difference even when facing an enemy with vast resources and years of training. Margaret wasn't a spy, wasn't a trained investigator, wasn't anyone special by conventional measures. She was just a cashier who noticed a pattern and refused to ignore it, who chose courage over comfort, who put everything at risk because she believed that what she had discovered was important enough to matter. And in the end, she was right, and her actions helped dismantle an intelligence operation that had been successfully stealing American secrets for years. And if that's not heroism, if that's not proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, then I don't know what is. So the next time you see something that doesn't quite feel right, the next time you notice a pattern that seems odd, the next time your instincts tell you something is wrong, remember Margaret Chen. Remember that your observations might be more important than you think, that your courage to report what you've seen might make a difference you'll never fully understand, because that's how real security works, not through satellites and supercomputers alone, but through millions of ordinary people who pay attention and care enough to act. And Margaret's story proves that sometimes the most powerful weapon against even the most sophisticated enemy is just one observant person with a notebook and the courage to see what everyone else has missed.